Good afternoon, Professor Howard.
Good afternoon, Roshan.
Absolute pleasure to see you again, and thank you for joining us here with the Sanasa Talent Development Center.
It's my great pleasure, and thank you, Sanasa Talent Development Center.
So I understand this is a very recently launched book. So can I start by asking you what motivated you to return to the subject of Marx in order to write about his theory of price and money?
Yes, I have to say it, even though it might reduce my audience for the first book. It was because I wasn't satisfied with what I did in the first book, in the sense that when I was researching it, I kept having the nagging feeling that I was missing something. And not only I, but actually the scholarship around Marx's theory of price, that we were all missing something. And what I realized towards the end, when I actually came to publish the book, is that there were two things missing. One is the theory of money. And although everyone says, no, we have a definitive theory of money and so on, that's actually not true. And the second is the theory of profit. These were two huge gaps for me. And what I was supposed to do originally is I was supposed to write the second book on international price and world money. But because I wasn't satisfied with the first book, I told the publishers that I was revising this and thinking of publishing two books before I came to this theory of international price and world money. And after a lot of back and forth, they agreed. And so this is the end product. I originally agreed to publish it in 2015. But as everyone knows me, especially my family, but also my friends and my students, until I'm really satisfied with something, and I've looked at it from every possible angle, I don't publish. I've never published for promotion. I've never published just for the sake of publishing. I want something that I publish to be as sound as I can possibly make it, which meant that it dragged on, and eventually it was published last year in January. And so the book that is this first part, money. And the one I'm currently working on is the theory of profit.
Right.
And so people jokingly say, is this going to take you another 10 years?
Yes, it's many years of refinement. So now that it's a finished product, I personally am looking forward to getting my hands on it. I'm sure as everyone is. Many different types of people seek your advice. Policymakers, students, academics, business leaders, investors. So this particular book, who would you say is it aimed at in terms of your readership?
Well, the starting thing is it's not aimed at any of those. It's an academic book. It's highly theoretical. And in a way, it's sorting out demons. I would say it's for PhD scholars and academics who are really interested in going back to the fundamentals in terms of theory. One qualification I must make, and I've made it several times in the past, is because I'm dealing with Marx and Marx's writings, people automatically think this is a book on socialism or communism. They think I'm writing about how a society transitions to communism or socialism, or actually how a socialist or communist system works. Neither of those two are applicable. I would also go further and say you don't have to be a leftist to appreciate this book. In fact, sometimes I think it's better if you're not a leftist. I think if your aim is to really search for knowledge, then this is the book for you. Because from my perspective, this is a dispassionate view of the science. And I believe Marx is one of the greatest economists, if not the greatest economist. And the pity is that people don't read Das Kapital. They don't read Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy for prejudice reasons. They already have made up their mind that this guy was responsible for, let's say, the Soviet Union or Mao's China, and we don't want to have anything to do with it. They don't realize what a great economist he was and how deep his thinking was. So, in that sense, my request is for people to bury their prejudices and look at this as they would look at any other academic text and consider the logic and the applicability of this work.
Excellent. This come with a lot of stereotypes in the academic world as well. I remember reading him for my bachelor's, so it was an eye-opener to see what he actually said. So would you be able to share a few insights on the content of the new book?
Yes. I think that it's difficult, of course, to share the contents in any depth unless we have a few days to spare. And even then, it's not so easy. But I would say what this is really about is looking in great detail at the theories of price of some of the major schools of thought and people who have been considered great economists of the past. So I look at modern day, what we call neoclassical economics. So this takes up a large part of the book. It's the last chapter in the book. And there you can't talk of one neoclassical economics because there's no one neoclassical economics, but I've identified three major strains with regard to the theory of price. I call them Austrians, Neo-Walrasians and Walrasians, and some people call the third group Marshallian, but I'm a bit ambivalent about what this third group is called, so I call them objective neoclassical approach, objective neoclassical approach to the theory of price. And I explain what that means. The other approaches that I consider are Keynesian and post-Keynesian. I take them as one, but I make a difference between Keynes's writings and modern-day post-Keynesians. The third group sometimes is considered to be part of the post-Keynesian grouping, and they're called Straffian economists. Obviously, they follow in the footsteps of the great Italian economist called Piero Sraffa. And I myself also consider, even though I disagree with his economics, I consider that he was another person who thought deeply about the subject and should have been accorded more respect than he is in the academic world. And then I go to the classical economists of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and I have a new take on their theories of price and money. And of course, I start off with Marx. So that's basically, in a nutshell, the different approaches. And what I try and do is see two things. How do they explain price in general? And within that context, how do they explain the theory of money? And when we talk of the theory of price, there are two major divisions amongst all economists. There is one group that begins with what is called relative price. And what that means, quite simply, is the value of one good in relation to another. So if I'm comparing apples and oranges, how many oranges can I buy with one apple? And we say this is the relative. So if it's 2 oranges for 1 apple, we say that is the relative price of the apple. And historically, many economists start like that. They say we have to look at relative price in the first instance, and then after that, we go to money price. So the economists I can mention are Smith, Ricardo, Sraffa, and the neoclassicals. They all have the same starting point, that it's relative price they start with. The other approach is called the money price approach, where we don't start with relative price, we start with explaining money price from the outset. And that is usually done in terms of money costs. And there are two competing approaches here. One is called the post-Keynesian, and the other is Marx's own writings. Now, one of the difficulties, and it is a grouping that I've also dealt with as a separate grouping, is the Marxists who have interpreted Marx. You have most of them historically have seen him explaining relative price from the beginning. But I believe this is a mistake, and it's a mistake because they have misread Marx's theory of money. The new approach, the new Marxist approach, actually does say, no, Marx actually was either explicitly or implicitly talking of a money price as the starting point. A lot of them actually say, well, Marx was wrong, and this is how you should start. But I argue that that's not true. That's actually a misreading of Marx's economics. So we have this theory of price, and then it leads to a certain theory of money. And that is what is very important about the book, is that I show that you can't get away from a certain theory of money when you have a starting point of relative prices. And the theory of money that you end up with is what we call the quantity theory of money. Right. That is, printing money causes inflation. So those people who interpreted Marx as starting with relative price end up saying that actually he's a quantity theorist, which is bizarre. Modern, exactly. Yes. In other words, he was a neoclassical economist, in effect, when it came to explaining things like inflation. So I have, of course, disagreed with that. But just to go back, this I do treat Marxists as another school of thought, and I want to show that actually I disagree with virtually all Marxists. And it comes back to the theory of price and the theory of money. And what I show in the book is that one group interprets Marx as if he's a neoclassical. The other group that says he starts off with a money price approach, they treat him as if he's a post-Keynesian. So, because
yes, a unique take on your perspective of what he was actually trying to.
Yes, because the other, let's say, the other approach, which is not Marx, to the theory of price, which starts with money price, is the post-Keynesian approach. So post-Keynesians will say, yeah, we totally agree with what you say. Those guys who start off with relative price are wrong. They should have started with the money price. Now, that is where the second book comes in. The second book shows that once we start digging into post-Keynesians, they're missing one very, very important ingredient, and that is productivity of labor. But that takes us a bit too far away from this book.
Yes, we may run out of time, but perhaps on another occasion we can delve a little bit more into that.
Sure.
But I think it's important to, it's slightly unfair to ask, but would you be able to summarize the expected key takeaways from your latest book?
Actually, it's not unfair, and I think it's something that I've done with this book, which I never did with the first book. And I think sometimes when you're writing a book, you actually don't know what the important implications are. When I wrote this book, I actually did start to understand where it was leading me. And one of the important implications that I came up with is what I think I just mentioned, is if you start with relative prices, then implicitly you start with the view that we are exchanging one good for another good, and we use money to facilitate that exchange. We say money is a medium of exchange. It's the most important function of money. And this leads us to a conclusion that the more money you put into the system to allow people to exchange goods, the higher the money prices of all those goods, the quantity theory of money. So that is the problem that faces all those who adopt this approach. So when you look at Adam Smith, he ends up with a quantity theory of money. David Ricardo, the same thing. Sraffa never actually went down that road and spoke about money. But because I know, or at least I feel in my bones, that Sraffa is one of the cleverest people that wrote on the subject of economics, I think he realized the implications of what he wrote in terms of the theory of money. So he would also have been a quantity theorist. And there are small snippets of his writings which I have taken out and shown in the book, which tell us that actually he realized he was going down the quantity theory road. And then you have all the Marxists who have reinterpreted Marx in a way that makes him a quantity theorist. So this is inevitable. They didn't realize it was going to happen. And what they do is they say, no, that's, even though it looks like he's a quantity theorist at some times. But that's because he was writing in a, let's say, a gold standard world. But if he was writing today, he would have said, the technical jargon is money is endogenous, like the Keynesians argue as well. But actually, they have a problem. They don't realize that once you interpret Marx as explaining relative prices to begin with, you end up with a quantity theory of money. You also end up saying that actually, in principle, we live in a barter world. You see, I'm exchanging my commodity for your commodity, which, of course, is absurd. So there are all these consequences.
Unless there are extreme circumstances, situations.
Unless there are extreme circumstances. Indeed, right. When money loses credibility altogether, let's say you have hyperinflation, then people start exchanging commodities. But let's assume we're talking about a normal system. I think, so the other takeaway is this, that when you go down Marx's road, then what you get is an explanation of price which allows you to say there are three forces operating on all prices in a capitalist economic system. We know that it's costs, so it's always cost plus profit margin for Marx. So it's costs is very important, and therefore things like raw material prices. The other approach can never say higher raw material prices causes inflation. They can't do that because there's only one thing that causes inflation. It's the quantity of money in the system. As long as the government doesn't print more, oil prices can rise by 100%, but there can be no increase in the prices in the domestic economy because it's only regulated by that one thing.
Just less traffic, perhaps less traffic.
That's right. And of course, the last 10 years has now disproven this because we had a lot of printing of money, especially in the advanced countries. I mean, when I say a lot, this was an extreme amount of printing, like we've never seen before. And yet, inflation actually fell over the decade, going right up to 2021. It only rose, not only in the advanced countries, but globally, when oil prices rose and energy prices rose. And when I say they rose, they doubled. So suddenly people became aware, wait a minute, costs are very important. And what about all this printing? It had no bearing. So you started getting people jumping ship, as it were, and saying, there's something wrong with the theory. Whereas with Marx, can easily say, if oil prices rise, prices of production will rise, and therefore retail prices will rise. He also can say that if the government runs a budget deficit, not prints money, but if the government runs a budget deficit, whether the central bank prints or doesn't print, it'll have inflationary consequences. Okay, so that's very important for the second. But the third one is the more intriguing one, and that is productivity. So we have seen a technology revolution in the last 5 to 10 years. And all technology revolutions are accompanied by a huge reduction in costs based on a massive rise in productivity. We know productivity has risen because we now need far less people to do the same jobs that we had them doing before. Now they're much more productive. Instead of producing 10 cars in a day, they will produce something like 10,000 cars in a day. Now, this means that once you are in a technology revolution, there's this huge downward pressure on prices. You see, from 2009 to 2021, prices fell. Massive budget deficits, huge printing of money, but prices still kept falling.
So in which region or globally?
Globally, So the advanced countries printed like mad. They ran huge budget deficits, but prices just kept falling. productivity change.
So one of the implications that I'm getting from listening to you is that the demand pull notion of inflation is much less significant than the cost push.
It is, but not necessarily. We are at this moment of high productivity, so therefore the downward pressure on costs is massive. But let's say if we go 20 years hence, I say we will go to the top of the business cycle, and that is the moment when productivity is weakest. Because now we have used all that new technology, it's now old, and therefore productivity is weak. And then if the government runs any budget deficit, it immediately hits inflation. That is why we had all the inflation in the 1970s, because that was the last time we went to a peak in the long cycle, you see. And productivity was so weak, it couldn't exert the downward pressure on prices.
Now with the dawn of the robotic and AI era, as you have also talked about in the past, the productivity is set to perhaps catapult to new highs.
Yes. And, there is actually a danger of deflation almost, negative price growth. Now, Japan has already had that, but we could see it again. And that's why you can see that a lot of governments don't worry at all about running big budget deficits. Take the US, for example. But eventually, once the productivity momentum slows, then running big budget deficits, having to service huge government debt is going to be problematic. Now, all the time, notice I'm talking of productivity, and I've missed one word: labor productivity. There's no such thing as capital productivity. It's always labor productivity. Ask any business person, what are you trying to do in your business? They will not say, I'm trying to make the machines more efficient. They will say, I'm trying to reduce unit labor cost. That's the secret of profits in all businesses, unit labor. Marx had a labor theory of value. His emphasis was labor productivity and price. That was his emphasis. The problem, why he was rejected, is there's a very important implication of the labor theory of value, and that is that the source of profit is labor productivity. But for the system, this is not a good thing for us to have in the system, because ideologically, we don't want to say that workers are the basis of profits. We want to say, no, it's my entrepreneurial genius that has made the profits, or it's this new machine that I bought, you see. So from the time of Marx's writing, you have had this constant attack on the labor theory of value. And Smith, actually, he wasn't against the labor theory of value, but he detected what he considered was a flaw. What we call today the transformation problem in Marx's economics, Smith already detected. And he bypassed it by saying value is, if you like, the corn we use to pay the workers. Okay, so he tried to bypass it, but he wasn't against this idea that labor productivity was the basis of profits. And in fact, when he had to explain profits, he came back to labor productivity, because he was a genuine scientist, in my view. I think you have the same with David Ricardo, but from that time onwards, you have a constant drumbeat against the labor theory of value, including Keynes, even though Keynes understood Marx and understood actually that labor productivity is at the heart of profits. Remember, Keynes was very close to the establishment in the UK, and his job and this is very well known, his job was to counter the growth of communism in the British universities. That was his job. And part of that was to come up with an economics that, let's say, was an alternative to the orthodox economics which young radicals were ditching, and gave, if you like, the appearance of being radical.
The British version of what they had in the US, was it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's why you have social democrats gravitating towards Keynesian economics. And let's say the Christian Democrats and Republicans are all with the neoclassical.
So, Professor Howard, coming back to Sri Lanka and your book, which seems to have an impressive array of the leading thinkers from the foundation of very foundation of economics, what would be the implications of some of these findings to a country like Sri Lanka with its unique set of challenges?
Well, I think I would start, let's say, at the general level. There's one implication which I'm now going to tease out. It's a very ambitious implication, and I've been saying it now for quite some time, is all the textbooks written, all the textbooks that have been used in the universities, the economics textbooks, they all start off with explaining a relative price, irrespective of the fact that they put dollar signs everywhere. Actually, they're explaining a relative price in the beginning, and that's why they end up with the quantity theory of money explanation of inflation. So this is a big ask. I mean, who is going to admit that they've written a textbook which actually is misleading students? And we're now not talking of one person, we're talking of an entire establishment, not just in the US or in Britain or in France or in Europe even. We're talking globally. That are we all going to say that we didn't know what we were talking about? I think it's a big ask. And so you just chip away and hope that the edifice falls at some time. In Sri Lanka, I've been using my writing to hammer away at central bank thinking on inflation and balance of payments problems, and in particular the crisis we had. So the blame was always put on government budget deficits and printing money. And I find myself in the very pleasant situation of having allies of my criticism of the quantity theory approach among all the central bankers of the advanced countries. So for the last 20 odd years, they have now confessed that what they believed in was wrong, and we have to rethink. Okay? The most recent example I gave was Jay Powell, the Federal Reserve Chair, who in a meeting with the Senate in 2021 de facto said, we have to rethink again. I have to, and he used the term, relearn economics. So I have these allies, and what I've been trying to do is to explain to the central bank and the people who have been following this quantity theory, sorry, you're wrong. And I have all these allies to prove you are wrong because they have not used any models. And that is very significant, you see, because we have trained our economists to use all these sophisticated mathematical and statistical models. And it came up with two conceptual arguments. So I won't go into the details of the conceptual arguments, but simply saying this is not the way central banks operate. I mean, in a nutshell, central banks set interest rate. They don't control the quantity of money. The commercial banks control the quantity of money. That's in a nutshell. Now, everyone knows this. And so I've been fighting actually a rearguard action in Sri Lanka to get Sri Lankans not to read my book, but to start by reading the various reports and studies done in the advanced countries by the central banks themselves. I mean, they've been publishing endlessly. The Bank of International Settlements, a very famous bank. It's a bank of the bankers, as it were. They have also published endlessly on this. So one consequence of them rigidly adhering to this view is our Central Bank Act in Sri Lanka, which is destructive and will actually reap havoc as we go down the road. And we have to amend it. It has to be amended because it's based on a misconception of economics. We now know it's based on a misconception of economics, but we were pressured into adopting it. And then, because we were pressured into adopting it, people rationalized it when there was no rationalization. So what I'm trying to do is to use my book to show that not only do we have allies amongst the central bankers in the advanced countries, but here is the logic underlying what they're saying. Okay, here is the theory of money, which disproves the underlying basis for having this central bank act, for example.
Sounds to me like you've unclothed the emperor to some extent.
I hope so. I hope so, Roshan. I hope so.
Fantastic. So let's hope your book will stimulate from academics all the way to policymakers and have the desired impact so that people break free from some of the control mechanisms in which I suppose the international economy works in a way that, as you said, countries like Sri Lanka, we have policymakers who may not fully understand what they're doing, but simply follow what they're told or what they were taught.
Right.
So here you're really attacking the foundation at the academic level, the foundation of economic theory itself. I'm personally looking forward to getting my hands on a copy of your book.
Great.
In the interest of time, is there anything you'd like to summarize in a nutshell?
Actually, it's to add something, and it's something that saddens me as I have now come into my retirement years, and I can, from afar, look at what's going on. And one of the things is that we don't read very much anymore. We don't read very much, we don't think critically, etc. One thing I will say is, if I compare Sri Lanka to other countries, still there is a very important residue in Sri Lanka, and that is the debate. Maybe it's not very informed, and I think that is one of the disappointments I have. People don't read. But still we have debate and discussion. And, you see lots of television programs where people are confronting each other with different ideas and so on. You don't really get that anywhere. It's lost in the universities. In lots of universities, you don't have debates as we used to have them. You don't have people reading in depth as we were encouraged to when I was much younger. So we were always encouraged to actually read the classics. And if you said, well, it's not worth reading it because, those guys are being discredited and so on, I remember being asked by a professor, okay, so what is wrong with it? And then you get stuck, and you're forced to go and read these things. So it's a culture, I hope, this book, because there are no mathematical formulae in it. Actually, there's one equation, but it's a very trivial one. But it's really conceptual. And it's showing that we never thought adequately about the concepts we use. We just went for the models. And this has stripped us of our critical intelligence. And so, as my parting request, it is, let's try and recapture some of that, especially in the universities where we can stimulate debate and get people to read more and think logically.
Yes.
Hopefully this book contributes in a small way.
I'm sure it will. And I hope the listeners will seize the opportunity to take the step towards free and independent thinking, thanks to Professor Howard's book. It's been an absolute pleasure, as always, to speak to you, Professor. And
pleasure is mine, Roshan.
I will be queuing up for my copy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Lovely.